Grant Hartwell's hand crushed Lena Ortiz's windpipe against the corrugated steel of Container 44B, and the back of her skull rang when he drove her face first into the locking bars hard enough to rattle the entire door. Air came in torn pieces. That was all she understood at first. His thumb sat under her jaw, fingers dug deep behind her neck, and every pulse in her throat felt like it hit a wall and bounced back into her ears. Metal tasted cold and bitter on her tongue. Her right cheek scraped along chipped paint and rust, while her boots searched for purchase on concrete, slick with thawed frost from incoming freight. She could hear the insulated compressor units down the corridor cycling on and off in heavy mechanical breaths, and in the half-second each unit paused, she heard herself trying to pull in oxygen and getting almost none. Grant held his phone in his left hand, front camera aimed at her face, smiling at his own screen like he was filming a prank and not a felony. "Say it," he said, voice tight with excitement. "Say you made it up." Lena tried to answer and gave him a broken sound. Her airway narrowed again when he tightened his grip. Her chest kicked. Her hands clawed his sleeve, then his wrist, then empty air. At the freight corridor at Hartwell Pavilion, stretched long and fluorescent around them, white light buzzing overhead, one red exit sign blinking at the far end, like it had forgotten what an emergency was for. The sound of her shoulder hitting steel carried farther than it should have. 16 people stood within 20 feet. 2 private security contractors in black jackets with hospital credentials clipped to their belts. 9 dock hands in reflective vests, gloves half off from unloading. 3 transport clerks with barcode scanners and tablets. 2 nursing supervisors in Navy scrubs, badges swinging against their chests. 16 pairs of eyes. Not one pair stepped between his hand and her throat. Nobody helped. Grant yanked her backward by the neck and slammed her into the side of the container again, this time near the serial plate bolted under the locking mechanism. 44B. The number jumped in and out of focus, black stencil on gray steel, while points of white static danced across her vision. He leaned in close enough that she smelled mint gum and expensive cologne, trying to cover whiskey. "You wanted compliance review," he said. "You got me." His laugh came sharp and small, a sound he had used for years as proof that consequences belonged to other people. Lena had seen him in board meetings from 30 feet away, loafers without creases, watch that cost more than her monthly rent, speaking in polished phrases about stewardship and innovation, while procurement data bled red in internal systems. No one outside logistics ever checked line by line. She had traced the numbers for 6 weeks in early morning shifts and late-night audits, invoice against manifest against install record, finding trauma oxygen systems billed as premium medical grade and swapped for low-cost assemblies that failed pressure tests, blood warmers listed as replaced but never delivered, emergency generators invoiced twice and maintained never. She had copied every file to an encrypted drive because she knew what happened to quiet objections in buildings named after donors. Now the donor's son pinned her to steel and filmed it. Her left knee buckled. He drove it straighter with his hip, trapping her in place. The locking bars bit her forearm when she tried to twist away. Her breath clipped into wet, panicked fragments that made no sense to her own ears. She heard one dock hand curse under his breath, not at Grant, at the inconvenience. Someone's radio crackled a call for a linen transfer on level 2. The world kept scheduling itself while oxygen left her body. At the edge of her vision, one transport clerk in blue scrubs looked down at a glowing tablet and scrolled inventory numbers with his thumb like this was weather and not assault. Grant lifted the phone higher. "Look at me," he said. "Say you falsified it. Say your access was revoked. Say you're unstable." She managed one word. No. He hit her with the heel of his hand under the jaw, not a punch meant to break, a strike meant to reset control. Her head snapped back into steel. A bright burst of pain flashed behind her eyes, then narrowed into a tunnel where only sound remained. Compressors, fluorescent hum, her own choking breath, and his voice counting down like a game. 5 seconds, he said. Then you go in and cool off. The private security contractors shifted weight, but did not move forward. One of them, older with gray at his temples, reached for his shoulder mic, stopped, and let his hand fall. The two nursing supervisors stood together by a pallet jack, one holding folded admission paperwork so tightly, the pages creased at the center. A doc hand stepped backward behind a crate of boxed IV tubing and stayed there, half hidden. Shame moved through the corridor like cold air from a cracked seal, and still nobody crossed the distance. Nobody spoke. Lena shoved at Grant's wrist with both hands and felt tendon and bone under expensive fabric. She had once packed chest wounds under rotor wash with dirt in her teeth and a radio dead in her ear, and she knew exactly how long a body had before panic became chemistry, and chemistry became collapse. She did not have long. She drove her heel down on his instep. He grunted, shifted, and answered by wrapping his fingers tighter around the front of her throat, until black dots surfaced at the corners of her vision. Still stubborn, he said, smiling for the camera. You should have taken the transfer. Her nephew's name rose in her head with no picture attached. Mateo, 8 years old. Missing front tooth. Left his socks under the kitchen table, no matter how many times she told him not to. She held that thought the way drowning people held floating wood. Across the corridor, the refrigeration unit connected to 44B kicked on, with a bass thrum that traveled through concrete. Condensation fogged along the lower seam of the container door. This unit was staged as equipment transfer on paper, priority freight, restricted access. She knew the manifest. She also knew there was no critical equipment scheduled at this hour, not in this lane, not without respiratory escort and chain of custody signatures she had personally flagged, missing 2 nights earlier. He had chosen this bay because cameras covered entrances, not interiors, and because cold erased fingerprints and good judgment. Grant shoved her face sideways against the bars again and angled the phone to catch her profile. This is what happens to liars, he said to the lens, voice louder now, performing for absent people he expected to praise him. The nearest security contractor finally spoke, barely above a whisper. Grant, that's enough? Grant did not look at him. You work for contract, he said. Contract works for my father. That ended it. Shoulders dropped. Eyes went flat. The contractor took 1 step back and joined the others in the ancient posture of institutional surrender. Nobody moved. Lena's pulse hammered against his palm. Her hearing narrowed further, then flared in strange detail. She heard a pallet wrap tear somewhere behind her. She heard the tiny clack of the clerk's fingernail against glass while he scrolled. She heard one nurse breathe in through her nose and hold it, as if not breathing might make her less responsible. She heard the container refrigerant line click open again and send another wave of cold through the steel pressed to her cheek. She tried to raise a hand and point at the camera mounted above the loading bay door. Her arm came halfway up and dropped. Grant noticed. His grin faded 1 degree. Don't worry, he said. This corridor had a maintenance outage. Funny timing. He had practiced that line. He had practiced several. The dock hands were lined along the yellow safety stripe like mannequins in reflective tape. One looked directly at Lena, then at the floor, then at the exit sign, then nowhere at all. Another pulled out his phone and lifted it chest high, Not to call, just to record from safer distance. One of the nursing supervisors shook her head once. Tiny motion. Then stared at the wall-mounted crash cart, as if waiting for someone with rank to authorize courage. Lena's knees dipped again. Grant dragged her upright by the throat and turned toward 44B, boots scraping concrete, phone still up, still filming. The locking bars clanged when his hip struck the door. He fumbled for the hasp with his free hand, cursed, then slammed her shoulder into the frame to keep her from sliding down. He was going to put her inside. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from. Subscribe if you believe veterans and working women deserve more than silence, and stay to the end because what happened in that loading bay did not just save one whistleblower, it tore down a family name, bolted to half the town. Grant lifted the locking lever and reached for the door seal. And that was when Atlas's ears pinned forward at the far end of the corridor, and his entire body went rigid. Then Atlas moved. The sound reached Lena before the shape did, claws striking sealed concrete in a controlled staccato that cut clean through compressor hum and fluorescent buzz. Not frantic, not confused, purposeful. Grant's grip shifted for half a second as he glanced down the corridor, and that half second gave Lena one ragged pull of air that burned all the way into her chest. Atlas came into full view under the harsh white lights, 87 pounds of tan and black saddleback, coat going dark as iron in shadow between loading bays, head low, ears pinned hard forward, every line of him aimed at container 44B like the corridor had narrowed into a single target. His growl rolled out low and steady, a warning from deep in the chest that made one dock hand step backward so fast he clipped a pallet corner with his heel. At the other end of the lead, Drew Thompson stopped without seeming to stop. NWU, Type 3 digital camouflage sat on him like an old promise. Broad shoulders, short dark hair with early gray at the temples, scar along the jaw that looked white under fluorescent light. His left hand settled on Atlas's harness handle. Not pulling, just confirming connection. He took in the scene in one pass. Lena pinned against 44B, Grant filming with one hand and levering the door with the other, 2 security contractors frozen in place, 16 witnesses arranged in a corridor built for logistics and denial. Grant gave a short laugh that came out thinner than before. Hospital corridor, he said, raising his phone toward Drew as if that settled the hierarchy. Restricted access. Drew did not answer him. His gaze dropped to the seam around 44B where condensation gathered in irregular patches. Human fog, not mechanical. Atlas leaned forward and inhaled once, hard, then planted both front paws against the steel at chest height with a hollow boom that echoed down the freight lane. The dog's body went rigid, hackles rising along his shoulders. The growl deepened. Lena felt the vibration through the bars against her face. One nursing supervisor whispered, "Oh, God," and the words vanished into the noise of the refrigeration line cycling up again. The older security contractor finally reached for his shoulder mic and keyed it twice. A useless burst, static only. Maintenance outage, Grant had said. Funny timing. Yet 3 ceiling cameras still held red standby lights over the bay doors, watching without intervening. Grant yanked Lena by the throat, trying to use her as a barrier between himself and the approaching dog. "Control your animal," he snapped. "Now." Drew's eyes stayed on Lena's airway, on the angle of Grant's thumb under her jaw, on the whitening knuckles at the side of her neck. He took one step closer. Atlas matched it instantly, weight coiled, breath steaming in short bursts. Lena heard metal tags click against Atlas's collar ring and knew, with the strange certainty that arrives at the edge of blackout, that somebody in this corridor finally understood how close she was to collapse. Grant read the uniform, then read the dog, then looked at the dock hands for reinforcement, and found only faces turned uncertain under reflective tape and warehouse light. The power dynamic bent without anyone announcing it. One clerk lowered his tablet. Another slipped his phone into his pocket and stopped recording. The younger security contractor moved 2 inches forward and seemed surprised by his own movement. "Back up," Grant said to them, voice climbing. "All of you. This is contract enforcement." Nobody obeyed. Atlas's ears rotated, then locked again on the container seam. His right rear leg carried a slight winter hitch even on dry concrete, an old Afghanistan wound that never fully left him, but his front half looked like forged steel. He scratched once at the lower panel, then lifted his muzzle and exhaled against the locking bars where Lena's breath had fogged and vanished. He was triangulating through vibration and scent, through layers of steel and cold and panic, reading the corridor in frequencies no one else could access. Drew saw what Atlas saw, not intellectually, instantly. Grant shoved Lena sideways, trying to drag open the door while keeping his phone pointed at her face. The locking lever clanged and jammed halfway. Lena's shoulder slammed the frame again. Pain flashed white, then tunneled. She braced on instinct and failed. Her boots slid on wet concrete. The world narrowed to fingertips digging her neck and the sound of Atlas's growl ratcheting higher. Drew's voice came flat and quiet, carrying farther than shouting ever could. "Hand off." 3 feet away, the order landed like a dropped weight. One dock hand flinched. A transport clerk muttered, "He's military," to no one and everyone. Grant bared his teeth at the phone camera, performing confidence with sweat already gathering at his hairline. "Do you know who I am?" he said. "Do you know whose building this is?" Drew took another step. Atlas surged once and checked himself at the harness because that was the discipline built over years of deployments and pain and trust. Lena watched the control in that movement and understood this was not a pet straining at chaos. This was a partner awaiting a command. Grant tightened his grip in response, and Lena's vision sparked. She made a sound she did not recognize as her own. "Last warning," Drew said. The older security contractor finally found his voice. "Grant, let her go." It shook, but it came out audible. And once spoken, it changed the room. The second supervisor in Navy scrubs moved toward the crash cart, hands trembling, preparing for what came next instead of pretending there would be no next. Grant laughed again, brittle now. "My father signs your contracts," he said to the guard without looking away from Drew. "You work for us." Atlas slammed both paws into the steel a second time, harder, the impact ringing across the corridor like a struck bell. The growl broke into one sharp bark, then settled back into a low rumble that vibrated through Lena's ribs. Drew's hand tightened once on the harness handle. The younger security contractor drew a slow breath and stepped to Lena's right flank, not close enough to provoke Grant, close enough to catch her if she dropped. Cowardice was still in the room, but it no longer owned all 16 bodies. Lena clawed at Grant's wrist and found leverage for half a second. Her medic training surfaced through oxygen debt in fractured pieces. Protect airway, create space, stay vertical, survive the minute. She drove her elbow back, clipped his ribs, felt him jerk, and gained another thread of air. Atlas responded instantly, ears hard forward, body loaded like a spring. Drew did not rush. That was what made Grant misread him again. No bluster, no anger, just tista math. Grant's thumb dug deeper under Lena's jaw. "You take one more step, she goes in," he said, jerking his head toward the open seam of 44B. Refrigerated air spilled out in a pale stream at ankle height. Drew's gaze shifted from Lena's throat to Grant's stance, to the phone in his left hand. Recording angle. Grip strength. Weight distribution. Exit lanes. He had run room entries with less information than this and higher stakes than a hospital corridor with 16 witnesses and one dying woman between him and a rich man who believed paperwork outranked consequences. He stopped exactly where Atlas's leash gave him full control and said nothing at all. Silence pressed down. Compressors cycled. Somewhere above them, ductwork ticked with expanding metal. Lena heard her heartbeat as a drum inside a tunnel, and beneath it, another rhythm. Atlas's low chest rumble, steady as a metronome. Grant turned his head to spit a command at the contractors. Detain him. Neither moved. His eyes flicked left, right, counting loyalty and coming up short. The moment stretched long enough for everyone to see it happen. The first crack in a protected life. This was the held breath. This was the edge. Before the next second lands, stay with this story and tell us where you're watching from, because distance never changed what courage costs. Subscribe if you believe veterans and working women deserve more than a room full of witnesses pretending not to see. Stay to the end, because the name over this building is about to mean evidence instead of immunity. Grant tried one last time to reassert the old order. Nobody touches me, he said louder, phone lifting again toward Drew's face. My father owns this hospital. The words bounced off steel and fluorescent light and died there. Atlas shifted his weight, then went perfectly still, eyes fixed on Grant's wrist at Lena's throat. Drew lowered his center of gravity by an inch, a subtle adjustment only people trained for violence would notice. The older security contractor noticed. His hand moved from shoulder mic to cuffs at his belt. Uncertain, but ready. One nursing supervisor set the crash cart brake with a loud metallic click that sounded, in that corridor, like a verdict. Lena felt her knees folding and forced them straight. She could not feel her fingertips. She could feel the cold leaking from 44B against her boots. She could feel Grant's pulse jumping fast through the hand crushing her airway. Fear had changed temperature in the room. It was no longer only hers. Drew finally spoke again, voice unchanged, almost gentle in its precision. Open hand. Grant stared at him, mouth parted, as if waiting for a longer speech he could argue with. None came. Atlas showed teeth without barking, controlled and silent. At the far end, one dock hand who had hidden behind boxed IV tubing stepped clear into open sightline and raised his own phone, this time aimed at Grant and the chokehold, not at Lena's collapse. Another followed. Then the clerk in blue scrubs, who had scrolled inventory while she suffocated, lifted his tablet and began recording too, face pale with the sudden understanding that digital records cut both directions. Witnesses were becoming a record. The corridor smelled of disinfectant, cold metal, fear, and the copper edge of adrenaline. Lena blinked sweat out of her eyes and locked on Atlas's face because it gave her one fixed point in a world swaying on black edges. The dog looked back at her once, brief and direct, then returned to Grant, guarding both threat and victim in the same breath. Grant dragged in air through his nose and adjusted his grip to yank Lena toward the container opening. Drew moved his right foot half a step. Atlas dropped his chest lower, ready to launch on command. And the story, right there in Hartwell Pavilion's freight corridor at midnight, drew a hard line between what this town had tolerated and what it would have to answer for once the door to the beginning finally opened. Now let's go back to the beginning, to a duplex on Alder Street where Lena Ortiz kept two alarms set 12 minutes apart because one life depended on her waking up and another depended on her never sleeping too deeply. She was 32, former Army medic, And she still woke at 0410 like someone might be bleeding in the next room. The first smell every morning was detergent from uniforms drying over the bathroom door. The second was canned chicken soup, reheated from Mateo's school thermos, because he said cafeteria noodles tasted like paper. His backpack stayed on the same kitchen chair, green with one broken zipper pull and a stitched patch of a cartoon wolf she had sewn on herself after a strap tore in October. On the fridge, his spelling list sat under a magnet shaped like a lighthouse. On the counter, her encrypted drive stayed taped beneath the lip of a ceramic flower jar no one would steal because no one stole flower jars. Irreplaceable was not a dramatic word in that house. It was routine. It was whose signature belonged on school forms and whose hands remembered to cut grape tomatoes in half because Mateo hated when they burst. She had been good at triage long before she became good at procurement trails. In the Army, she had learned to assess airway, breathing, circulation under rotor wash, and those habits never left her. In logistics auditing, she assessed systems the same way. What keeps people alive, what fails first, who gets hurt when somebody chooses margin over integrity. Hartwell Pavilion hired her because she could read supply chains like casualty maps. They expected efficiency. They got scrutiny. By the second week of August, she had started seeing the first fracture in the numbers. A trauma oxygen manifold. Top-tier model, invoiced at full cost. The receiving photo attached to the invoice showed a casing seam no premium manufacturer used. She tagged it, verified lot numbers, requested install records, and found the maintenance entry signed without serial confirmation. One discrepancy could be sloppiness. She had seen sloppiness. Sloppiness had a texture. This had choreography. She kept digging after Mateo went to bed. Laptop open, lamp low, bills stacked under a coffee mug, gone cold. Invoice against manifest. Manifest against receiving log. Receiving log against biomed maintenance schedule. She built spreadsheets with color coding she never showed anyone, and notes in plain language in case she ever had to explain it to people who thought logistics meant boxes instead of outcomes. Trauma oxygen systems billed premium, swapped with cut-rate assemblies. Blood warmers listed as replaced, units never entered inventory. Emergency generator parts billed twice through 2 shell vendors that shared a mailing address and 1 tax preparer. She copied each file to the drive in the flower jar, then to a cloud vault under 2-factor authentication and a passphrase built from Mateo's favorite planet and her sister's birth month. Her sister Elena had died 18 months earlier from a sudden cerebral hemorrhage at a bus stop 2 blocks from that same duplex. No warning, no goodbye. Lena had identified her at county intake under fluorescent light that made everyone look both awake and gone. Mateo had stood beside her in shoes with untied laces and asked whether grown-ups also got sent to the forever place. Lena had said yes, and then she had taken him home and learned how to braid small routines into a safety net wide enough for both of them. At 1900 every night, he read 1 chapter aloud from a library book and stumbled on long words with his tongue pressed against missing teeth. At 1930, she checked his homework and signed the folder. At 2000, she locked the front door, checked the back window, and sat at the kitchen table until midnight hunting numbers that did not belong to medicine. She did it because she had already watched too many people die politely in institutional light. When she first raised concerns internally, she followed the book. She sent a quiet email to procurement compliance, attached 3 examples, and requested a closed review. No accusations, no dramatic language, just line items and variance percentages. 48 hours later, her access to 2 vendor folders was temporarily restricted for system maintenance. 72 hours later, an IT ticket appeared under her ID documenting a password reset she had not requested. The signal was clear. Someone had noticed her noticing. 3 days passed before she told anyone out loud. She told Marcy Bell, one of the nursing supervisors from Night Freight, because Marcy had worked 20 years without once pretending equipment quality did not matter. They stood by the staff vending machines at 0245, coffee too hot and sugar clumped in stale packets. Lena kept her voice low and said, "If these oxygen units fail under load, we don't get a second chance." Marcy looked at her for a long second and nodded toward the security camera dome over the hallway. "You didn't say that to me," she whispered. Then, after a pause that looked like fear, deciding whether to stand up, she added, "You're not wrong." That same week, Lena requested a federal compliance review through the Protected Reporting Channel. She uploaded 27 files, 10 cross-reference screenshots, and one memo she wrote in plain language. Supply substitutions in life-critical systems create foreseeable patient harm. She hit submit at 0013 with the duplex silent, except for the refrigerator motor and Mateo breathing through a mild whistle from seasonal allergies down the hall. She sat there in the blue glow of the monitor and shook for a full minute, not because she doubted the data, but because she understood the people attached to it. By the first week of September, she had stopped parking in the same spot twice. She also stopped posting school pictures, stopped tagging locations, stopped answering unknown numbers. Twice, she found her mailbox open with nothing missing. Once, she came out of a grocery store and found her windshield wiper lifted on the driver's side only. Old intimidation trick, nothing legal, message delivered. A private number called at 2318 and said, "Transfers can solve stress," then hung up. She filed the timestamp and moved on. At Hartwell Pavilion, she walked under steel letters spelling a family name, large enough to cast shadow over the entrance at noon. Hartwell Pavilion, Hartwell Imaging, Hartwell Family Atrium. Their donations paid for architecture and bought silence wholesale. Lena had grown up in towns like this where philanthropy and pressure wore the same cufflinks. Grant Hartwell wore those cufflinks wrong, too flashy for daylight, and believed that made him formidable. He was 26 and moved through loading bays like a man testing how far gravity would bend for him. Designer sneakers on polished concrete, leather jacket indoors, phone always in hand, camera off and on. He introduced himself to new staff with his first name and his father's surname in the same breath, as if one was title and the other a threat. Grant Hartwell. Freight contracts answer to us. He said it to dock hands, to clerks, to nurses carrying case carts heavier than he had ever lifted. His father, Charles Hartwell, had built half the commercial strip along County Route 9 and funded the police department's tactical equipment line through the Hartwell Civic Foundation. New patrol SUVs came with that foundation decal on the quarter panel. Scholarship dinners featured Charles at center table, beneath framed photos of ribbon cuttings and smiling board chairs. When local news covered hospital expansion, microphones found him first. Inside the institution, power was less visible and more precise. Hartwell Logistics Group held the private freight contract for after-hours sensitive transfer. Their badge access could override internal routing at loading docks if coded as external vendor movement. Their dispatch software fed directly into the hospital's chain of custody dashboard. If you controlled those fields, you controlled where things appeared to have been, even when they never arrived. Lena learned this because every false invoice looped back to freight timing windows Grant's team managed. By mid-September, she had a pattern broad enough to survive courtroom light. Cut rate oxygen components entered through secondary vendor IDs, and got relabeled under approved codes before installation. Maintenance confirmations were signed by technicians who never physically saw the units, but trusted digital records stamped by freight intake. Emergency generator parts moved through a subcontractor with no biomedical license, then vanished into expedited transfer status. No one audited line by line. It was theft, with clinical consequences and legal insulation built in from the first keystroke. She took the packet to internal counsel anyway. She asked for documentation of vendor verification. She asked for conflict disclosures on procurement approvals. She asked for chain of custody hard copy backups. Counsel thanked her for diligence, advised patience, and CC'd two administrators whose last names sat on donor plaques next to Hartwell's. The next morning, Grant was waiting near Bay 3, leaning against a crate of sterile tubing, like it belonged to him. "People get ambitious," he said, smiling without warmth. "Then they get transferred." Lena kept walking. "People also get subpoenaed," she said. His smile held. "My father owns this hospital." He said it once, and for years that had been enough. Two security contractors stood 10 feet away and studied a wall map they already knew by heart. A transport clerk suddenly needed to rescan an already scanned pallet. Everyone in that corridor understood the script. Wealth announced itself. Staff looked away. Day continued. Lena felt the old combat anger rise and flatten into discipline. Rage was noise. Records were signal. She filed an external supplement that afternoon with freight log exports and badge access anomalies, and this time she included names. 3 days later, her schedule changed without notice. Shift end moved from 2300 to 0000. Exit route reassigned through freight because parking lot resurfacing. Her badge briefly failed at the staff elevator, then reactivated after a call to security that logged no incident report. At 23:52, she received an auto-generated text directing her to Container 44 staging for urgent audit confirmation. She had never received an audit request by text in her life. She screenshotted it and sent it to her personal encrypted account before walking down. At home that evening, Mateo asked why she kept checking the deadbolt twice. She told him grown-ups sometimes forgot things, and she liked being sure. He accepted that and returned to drawing a dog with armor plates and a cape on lined notebook paper. He slid it across the table and said, "This one finds people even in boxes." Lena taped the drawing beside the lighthouse magnet and stared at it longer than she meant to. By the last week of September, Marcy Bell stopped whispering around cameras and started leaving her phone recorder on in her scrub pocket during freight disputes. 2 dock hands quietly gave Lena copies of revised manifests that did not match originals. One clerk from overnight transport sent her a screenshot of a deleted routing code that rerouted container temperature controls through vendor access. Good people were still scared. Good people were moving anyway, 1 inch at a time. That was why Grant escalated from pressure to force. Paper trails had begun to multiply outside his control. On the night everything converged, rain had blown sideways against the loading bay doors and dried in streaks of mineral salt by midnight. Lena finished her shift, checked her phone, and saw one message from Mateo's after-school caregiver. He did great on spelling. She typed back a thumbs up and a thank you, then looked at the freight text again. Urgent audit confirmation. 44 staging. She walked toward the corridor because she needed one more confirmation, one more data point, one more piece of chain of custody truth before federal investigators pulled records and people started deleting what they could. She also walked because in institutions like Hartwell Pavilion, declining a suspicious order was sometimes treated as confession. When she reached the freight lane, 16 people were already there, And Grant Hartwell stood by container 44B with his phone in his hand and a smile that had never met resistance long enough to recognize it. The beginning had always been this simple. A woman with evidence, a man protected by a surname, and a room full of people trained by years of consequence to confuse silence with survival. The beginning had always been that simple, and in another wing of the same building, a man in camouflage was trying, again, to outwalk a night that would not release him. Drew Thompson had been awake for 31 hours when the automatic doors at Hartwell Pavilion's east vestibule opened and closed on a loop of cold air and disinfectant. He wore NWU Type 3 the way some men wore prayer, not for display, for structure. The fabric sat sharp across broad shoulders built by work and years of carrying load under heat and armor, and the pale scar along his jaw looked almost silver under the lobby's recessed lights. He kept one hand on Atlas's harness, thumb hooked through webbing, worn smooth by use, while the other hand stayed free at his side. Free hand, open angle to exits, constant scan. Hypervigilance had become muscle memory so complete, he no longer called it a symptom. The security guard at the desk had seen him 3 nights in a row and stopped pretending this was unusual. "Can't sleep?" the guard asked quietly. Drew looked toward the glass doors, then the reflection behind them, then the corridor intersection to his left. "No," he said. That was all. It was 0306. The vending machines hummed. Somewhere deep in the building, a transport cart squealed on a dry wheel bearing, and then went silent. Drew counted his breaths in sets of 4 because that was what the team psychologist had taught him after Yemen, and he hated that it worked just enough to prove he needed it. Every time the hospital HVAC shifted pitch, his mind dragged him back to rotor wash and red cabin light, and Nolan Reed's hand slipping against a failing oxygen line, while a medic shouted pressure numbers that kept dropping anyway. He still heard that manifold fail in his sleep. A short hiss, a hard click, then nothing useful. Nolan had been 29, JTAC qualified, left-handed, and the only man on Drew's element who could tie a tourniquet one-handed in complete darkness while giving radio corrections with his other hand. In Yemen, they had exfiltrated under fire with 2 casualties in 1 narrow weather window. The medevac bird should have gotten Nolan to surgery alive. It had not. Field oxygen pressure collapsed en route because a component in the transport manifold cracked under load. Later reports called it a systems failure. Drew called it theft with distance from the crime scene. The guilt never arrived as one emotion. It arrived as logistics. He should have checked the secondary regulator himself. He should have forced a different bird. He should have argued louder on tarmac. He should have ignored rank and delayed wheels up by 90 seconds. Facts and ghosts lived in the same drawer now. By the 2nd week after the funeral, sleep became negotiation and silence became threat. He rented a small house near the Naval Annex because it had 2 exits and sight lines from the kitchen to both approaches. He placed a ceramic bowl by the front door for Atlas's water, boots to the left of it, keys on a hook exactly 6 inches above. Predictable layout reduced startle. The doctors wrote insomnia on paper and handed him options in the white bottles. He took them twice, woke heavy and angry, and stopped. Long walks replaced medication. 3 a.m. became his operational hour, the time when fewer people spoke, and most buildings told the truth through mechanical sound. He stayed in uniform, even off active rotation, because civilian clothes made him feel unarmored in ways he could not explain to people who had never slept through indirect fire. 4 months after Yemen, Command gave him 6 weeks mandatory decompression and told him to reintegrate. Drew went to the Fort Sailor Disposition Center instead, where retired military working dogs waited in chain-link runs that smelled of bleach, wet concrete, and the sorrow of being useful in the past tense. Atlas had been there 41 days, kennel card clipped to the gate with block letters and caution notes. MWD German Shepherd. Deployment veteran. Right hip injury. Noise sensitivity. Handler deceased. The deceased handler line sat like a punch. Atlas stood at the back of the run when Drew first approached, head level, eyes fixed, body still in that particular way trained dogs used to measure intent. Tan and black saddleback coat, deep chest, old scar tissue visible where hair thinned near the right flank. 87 pounds and underweight by 3. He did not bark. He watched. Drew crouched without reaching through the fence and waited. After a minute, Atlas stepped forward once, ears rotating like satellite dishes catching a distant signal. Drew saw the limp when the dog shifted weight to the right rear leg. Old damage, not current pain, but enough to change gait in cold weather. He saw a second thing, too, less visible and more important. Atlas checked Drew's hands first, then his eyes, then the corridor beyond him. Assessment pattern of a working partner, not a kennel dog waiting for affection. The disposition sergeant had told Drew. He's hard to place. Why? Drew asked. Liability profile, the sergeant said. High drive, combat condition. Can't go to a family with kids running around. Needs someone with working background and time. Most applicants want a photo dog, not this. Drew kept his gaze on Atlas. I have time. Paper says otherwise, the sergeant replied, tapping the file. Insomnia treatment. Recent operational trauma marker. Command may flag it. That was the adoption battle in one sentence. Not whether Drew loved the dog, whether bureaucracy trusted a grieving operator to keep a grieving MWD alive. For 3 weeks, he filed forms between medical check-ins and mandatory counseling sessions. He secured written recommendations from a team medic with gray in his beard and scars on both knuckles, from a kennel master who had worked Kandahar rotations, and from a commanding officer who said only, Thompson follows through. He completed home inspections, liability waivers, emergency care planning, muzzle handling tests, controlled exposure drills. He sat through a board interview where a civilian risk consultant asked whether he could manage his own emotional regulation in a domestic environment. Drew answered, I can manage mission requirements. The consultant frowned. This isn't a mission. Drew looked at Atlas through the glass panel of the holding corridor and said, That depends on your definition. At week 5, disposition denied the application, pending additional review. Atlas remained in Run C7, where fluorescent lights never fully turned off and every evening ended with kennel doors clanging shut in sequence. Drew did not argue in the room. He went home, opened his laptop, and wrote a 12-page appeal with deployment citations attached, veterinary assessments, and a transition plan with training benchmarks mapped by week. He ended with one line. Retiring service assets without bonded placement increases aggression, risk, and euthanasia probability. This dog has already paid for this country in blood. 7 days later, a deputy commander signed the override. Drew collected Atlas on a rainy Tuesday at 0612. The sergeant handed him a thick envelope of records and a folded leash with frayed edges. He won't do well with uncertainty, the sergeant said. Neither will I, Drew answered. That was 4 years ago. Atlas had not left his side since. By late October of that first year, their nights settled into a pattern that kept both of them functional. Drew walked exterior perimeters before dawn when his chest felt too tight for indoor air. Atlas ran scent ladders in empty training lots, then slept with his head against Drew's boot, while morning light climbed the wall. When nightmares came, Atlas woke first. Always first. He would press his muzzle to Drew's sternum until breathing slowed, then stay there, eyes open, guarding the room as if mortar alarms still existed beyond the drywall. No therapist had given Drew that level of consistency. No medication had either. At Hartwell Pavilion, 3 nights before Lena walked toward container 44B, Drew had come in for a vestibule circuit after another failed attempt at sleep. Atlas had paused near a wall-mounted donor board and stared at one brass plate long enough for Drew to notice the name etched in polished letters. Hartwell Civic Foundation, Critical Care Modernization Initiative. Drew stood there with one palm on Atlas's neck and read the line twice. The word oxygen sat 3 rows down in smaller font as part of a campaign slogan. He felt the old anger turn cold and precise. In the week that followed, he started hearing freight bay compressors cycle at odd intervals during his 0300 walks. Atlas heard them sooner and sometimes stopped dead, head tilted, listening to low frequencies transmitted through slab concrete. Right hip stiff and cold, ears forward, body locked. Drew had seen that posture in Afghanistan, seconds before Atlas alerted, on buried pressure plates no human eye could detect. He trusted it more than any dashboard metric in any administrative briefing. Atlas was 6 years old when he and Drew first deployed together as a paired element. German Shepherd, 8 deployments, 23 lives saved documented in action reports, and at least 3 more never formally counted, because paperwork did not always survive field reality. In Kandahar, Atlas tracked a missing interpreter through a collapsed wadi after midnight and found him alive under 2 feet of debris. In Helmand, he alerted on a concealed IED near a school wall and forced a reroute that spared a convoy and 20 civilians who never knew his name. In northern Afghanistan, he entered a compound breach through smoke, thick enough to blind cameras, and held on a barricaded shooter long enough for Drew's team to clear the room without firing into unknown corners. Decorations existed for some of it. Most of it lived in logbooks and scar tissue. The named wound came during a compound breach outside Sangin. Winter deployment, wind hard enough to sandblast exposed skin. Atlas had cleared the threshold with his camera feed live when an improvised fragmentation charge detonated from a secondary doorframe trap. Shrapnel tore through his right hip and lower flank, and the sound he made over comms was a short, stunned yelp that Drew still heard sometimes in the space between waking and memory. Team medic stabilized him under fire. Medevac carried him out with one paw braced against Drew's forearm, refusing sedation until Drew climbed into the aircraft. Surgeons removed the largest fragments. One sliver remained too close to the sciatic branch to extract safely. Cold weather made it burn. Low-frequency vibration traveled through that damaged tissue in ways healthy muscle did not. A side effect turned strange advantage. Atlas could detect certain mechanical and biological rhythms through metal barriers faster than most acoustic devices. He could hear distress where others heard machinery. After medical retirement review, one evaluator wrote diminished operational utility due to gait irregularity. Another wrote unsuitable for standard family adoption. Neither report mentioned that Atlas still scanned exits first, still checked Drew's pulse with his muzzle during panic spikes, still refused to eat until Drew touched his bowl once with 2 fingers the way he had in deployment camps between hurried feeds and incoming alerts. Forgotten hero was too soft a phrase for an animal that had given tendon, blood, and years, then been filed as risk. Drew read every line in that packet and signed where they told him. Then he took Atlas home anyway. At 0314, back in the hospital vestibule on the night Lena entered freight, Drew paused by the glass and watched rainwater residue silvering the loading bay pavement outside. Atlas stood close, shoulder against Drew's knee, breath steady. From somewhere deeper in the building came a low industrial thrum, then a pause, then another thrum with a faint irregular pulse layered beneath it. Atlas lifted his head, ears pinned forward, body rigid in one clean line. Drew felt the change travel up the harness like current. He did not ask whether the dog was sure. Atlas had been sure in Kandahar, in Helmand, in Yemen, and in every sleepless room since. Drew turned toward the freight corridor and moved, boots silent on polished tile. The dog at his left side carrying old pain and unbroken purpose in the same stride. By 0316, Drew and Atlas reached the freight intersection, and the corridor opened in front of them like a wound he already recognized. Lena was on steel, not standing so much as being held upright by Grant Hartwell's hand at her throat, her boots skidding on wet concrete, face turned against the locking bars of container 44B, while Grant filmed her with his left hand and worked the door hardware with his right. The refrigeration unit cycled with that same bass pulse Atlas had caught from the vestibule, and now Drew heard the second rhythm inside it. A human body fighting for air in short, failing draws. 16 witnesses stood in a crooked arc where yellow floor tape marked the freight safety line. 2 security contractors in black jackets, 9 dock hands in reflective vests, 3 clerks with tablets and scanners hanging from wrists, 2 nursing supervisors frozen near a crash cart no one had touched yet. One clerk in blue scrubs stared at his screen, thumb still scrolling inventory counts in neat columns while Lena's breath broke apart less than 4 feet away. He should have looked up sooner. They all should have. Atlas's ears pinned forward, his body locked. A growl started low, the same rolling warning Drew had felt through helicopter floors and blast walls in other countries, and this corridor changed shape around that sound. Men who had been pretending not to see began seeing too much. Grant jerked Lena harder against the bars and laughed toward his phone camera. "Say you lied," he said. "Say it now." Lena tried to answer and produced a scraped whisper that collapsed into a cough. Her left hand clawed at his wrist, fingers slipping on his watch band. Her right arm shook when she tried to brace against the door. Drew saw swelling at her jawline, blotchy color rising along her neck, and a tremor in her knees that meant she was at the edge of losing consciousness. He did not need a monitor. Airway compromise was visible in the geometry of her face. Atlas pulled once into the harness, controlled but loaded, eyes fixed on the hand crushing her throat. Drew walked forward at a measured pace, boot soles quiet on concrete. He did not accelerate. He did not announce himself. Calm traveled ahead of him, like pressure in front of a storm. The older security contractor recognized it first and shifted his stance from passive observation to ready posture, hand hovering near his shoulder mic, then dropping to the cuff case at his belt. Not committed yet. No longer neutral. Grant noticed the movement and snapped, "Stay put." No one answered him. Lena heard Atlas before she could focus on him. She knew that sound from nowhere, in her memory and everywhere at once. Not panic, not noise, a warning with rules inside it. She forced one eye open through tears and saw tan and black at the end of the corridor. Coat dark as iron in the shadow between bay lights, head low, eyes fixed on Grant's wrist. Behind the dog stood Drew Thompson in digital camouflage, jaw scar pale under fluorescent glare, expression emptied down to task. Her brain, oxygen-starved and flickering, connected one fact to another. Navy uniform, working dog posture, controlled approach. She held on to that sequence like rope. Grant angled his phone toward Drew and widened his grin for an audience that existed mostly in his own head. "You're in my lane," he said. "Restricted access." Drew did not take the bait. His gaze moved once. Lena's airway, Grant's grip, door latch position, hinges, witness spacing, wet floor, camera angles. Atlas tracked with him, hackles raised but feet precise, matching speed at his left leg until they were 6 yards out. The refrigeration line hissed. Condensation beaded thick along the 44B seam. Lena felt cold air spilling around her boots from a door that was not fully open yet. She understood then in one brutal, clear flash that Grant had not only wanted her to recant, he had wanted her inside the container where sound was swallowed and chain of custody logs could be rewritten by morning. Her panic sharpened into anger so clean it steadied her for 1 second. She drove her elbow backward toward his ribs. She clipped him, not enough to break hold, enough to make him tighten and reposition. Black spots surged at the edge of her vision. A nursing supervisor whispered, "Please," but did not step forward. A dock hand lifted his phone chest high and started recording from behind a pallet stack, still choosing distance over intervention. Another dock hand looked directly at Lena, then at Drew, then at Atlas, and lowered his gaze like a man watching judgment approach in a language he finally understood. Grant dragged Lena half a step toward the container opening. "Last chance," he said to her. "You go quiet, this gets easy." Lena tried to speak Mateo's name and could not shape it. Only air mattered, and she did not have enough. Atlas broke formation and rose, front paws striking the steel door at chest height with a booming impact that rang down the corridor and into everyone's teeth. The sound landed where speeches never reached. 3 people flinched at once. The clerk with the tablet stopped scrolling. Grant recoiled, then yanked Lena closer as shield. "Control your dog," he barked, voice cracking on the last word. Drew took one more step and stopped inside command distance. His hand tightened on the harness handle, not restraining panic, channeling force. Atlas held position against the steel, claws scraping for purchase, growl deepening as he tracked vibration through the door and through Lena's chest. He could hear her heartbeat, stuttering under cold and compression. He could hear Grant's pulse racing faster in the wrist at her throat. Silence spread in a jagged line through the witnesses. The corridor smelled of disinfectant, wet cardboard, motor oil from pallet jacks, and fear turning metallic in the mouth. Grant lifted his chin, still filming. "Do you know who you're talking to?" Drew's voice came out flat and exact. "Let her go." 2 words, no heat, no performance. Grant laughed, but this time it arrived thin and delayed. "My father owns this hospital." He said it like a shield he had never seen fail. He expected the room to settle back into obedience. He expected eyes to drop, shoulders to fold, hands to stay at sides. For years, the phrase had ended arguments before they began. This time, it hung in fluorescent air and did nothing. Atlas dropped from the door, circled half a step, and planted himself directly between Grant and the nearest open lane, body angled, weight forward, teeth bared in disciplined silence. Drew moved with him, mirrored and close, one line of pressure with no gaps in it. The younger security contractor stepped toward Lena's right flank, close enough to catch her if she dropped. One nursing supervisor rolled the crash cart 6 inches forward and set the brake with a hard metallic click that sounded like permission. The clerk in blue scrubs raised his tablet and started recording the chokehold he had ignored minutes earlier. Witnesses were becoming evidence. Grant saw it happen and blinked as if the room had betrayed a contract. He jerked Lena again, trying to regain center. "Detain him," he snapped at security. "Now." Neither contractor moved. Drew kept his eyes on Grant's hand and spoke again, each word separate. "Open it. Now." Grant's mouth opened for another name drop, another threat, another inherited guarantee. Nothing came for a beat. He looked at Drew's uniform, then at Atlas, then back to Drew's face, searching for anger he could provoke or uncertainty he could exploit. He found neither. What looked back at him was outcome, already calculated. Lena's knees folded. The younger contractor caught her elbow before she hit concrete, but Grant still had her throat. She made a wet, involuntary sound and clawed at his fingers with fading strength. Atlas surged upward, hammering the door with both paws again, louder this time, and barked once, a single blast that snapped through the corridor like a starter pistol. Grant flinched hard enough that his phone slipped in his grip and nearly fell. Drew saw the shift and moved his right foot half a step to close angle. Atlas lowered his chest, ready for release command, tail rigid, eyes locked on the target hand. Years of training held him at the edge of violence without crossing it. The older security contractor finally keyed his shoulder mic. "Freight corridor, Bay 4, he said, voice shaking. "Active assault. Need unit and medical now." Static answered first. Then dispatch acknowledged, external contact made. No taking it back. Grant heard the call, and panic cracked through his expression for the first time. "You don't get to call that in," he hissed. The contractor held his gaze. "Already did." One dock hand stepped clear of the pallet line and said, almost to himself, "Keep filming." Another repeated it louder. "Keep filming." Phones rose in 3 different hands now. Each lens pointed the same direction. Each timestamp a nail in the old system's coffin. Grant tightened reflexively, fingers digging deeper into Lena's neck. Atlas erupted into a full-throated growl that shook the steel bars. Drew's voice cut through it, sharper now, but still controlled. "Open hand." Grant stared at him. The corridor narrowed to those 2 men and the dog between them. Lena's breath hitched, failed, returned in a ragged thread. Condensation ran down the container seam like sweat. Drew did not blink. He did not negotiate. The scar along his jaw caught white light when he shifted his head 1 inch, and Atlas matched that movement exactly. An old team working one problem with shared timing. Grant saw the synchronization, and for the first time in his adult life, understood he was not the most dangerous person in the room. He looked into Drew's eyes and found no rage there, only the cold certainty of a man who had buried teammates, fought bureaucracies, and stopped counting how many times institutions failed until he stopped waiting for them to do the right thing first. Grant's breathing turned shallow. His wrist trembled at Lena's throat. The phone in his left hand dipped lower. He had just realized the family name over the building could not reach him fast enough. Atlas rose again, slammed both forelegs into the steel inches from Grant's shoulder, and held there, a wall of tan and black loyalty vibrating with restrained force, while Drew gave one final command, quiet enough to feel like ice. "Release her. Now." Grant's fingers flexed once against Lena's throat. Then he tried to yank her backward into the gap of 44B. Drew closed distance and took him apart in 4 seconds. His left hand clamped Grant's recording wrist and drove it down. The phone smacked concrete and spun under a pallet jack. His right forearm cut across Grant's elbow, peeled the chokehold open, and redirected him away from Lena with a pivot that looked almost gentle until Grant hit the floor hard on his shoulder. Atlas surged in the same instant and planted over Grant's chest, teeth bared inches from his jaw, growl vibrating through steel and bone. The younger security contractor caught Lena under both arms as her legs gave out. Marcy Bell was already moving the crash cart. "Airway," she said, voice shaking but clear. Lena folded forward, coughing in torn bursts, one hand clamped over her bruised neck. The corridor smelled like cold refrigerant and adrenaline. Drew dropped to one knee beside her long enough to check her pupils and breathing pattern, then looked up at Marcy. She was going hypoxic, he said. Grant twisted under Atlas and spat toward Drew's boots. Get this mutt off me. My father owns this hospital. Atlas did not move. Drew did not look at Grant. Cuffs, he said. The older contractor hesitated one beat, then pulled his restraints and locked Grant's wrist behind his back, while Atlas held pressure with disciplined stillness. That small metallic click traveled farther than any shouted order. Two dock hands kept filming. The clerk in blue scrubs filmed too, hands trembling so badly the frame shook. Sirens reached the bay doors less than a minute later. 3 county deputies came in first, then hospital administration in rumpled coats, then Charles Hartwell in cashmere, and Anger, face pale under fluorescent light. He took in his son on concrete, Atlas over him, 12 phones raised, and Lena on oxygen from the crash cart. What is this circus? Charles said. Uncuff him. One deputy stepped forward as if to comply. Then the older security contractor held up his body cam and said, I called it in as active assault. We have multiple recordings. We have victim statements. And we have the container. Charles turned on him. You work for my contract. Not anymore, the contractor said. The deputy still looked uncertain until a woman in a dark federal windbreaker came through the corridor with 2 agents behind her and a document folder already open. Dana Pike, HHSOIG, badge clipped high and visible. She looked at Lena, then at 44B, then at Grant on the floor. Scene is now federal preservation, Pike said. Nobody touches that container. Nobody alters logs. Nobody calls IT to rotate storage. Chain of custody starts now. Charles held out both hands in theatrical disbelief. On what basis? Pike pulled a printed packet from the folder. Protected compliance submission filed 6 weeks ago by Lena Ortiz. Supplement filed 3 days ago with freight anomalies, badge overrides, and vendor substitutions on life-critical systems. Tonight we add attempted homicide, retaliation against a whistleblower, assault on camera, and evidence tampering indicators. She turned to a deputy. Read him his rights. Grant laughed once, brittle and high. This is harassment. The deputy began anyway. By 4:02 a.m., the freight corridor had become an evidence grid. Yellow markers sat by Grant's dropped phone, by scrape marks near the locking bars, by the door latch where Lena's skin cells and his fingerprints would both be found. A forensic tech photographed condensation patterns along the 44B seam, while another measured interior temperature. The maintenance outage claim lasted exactly 9 minutes. Hospital IT arrived with logs showing corridor cameras, had failed over to battery at midnight, and mirrored to an off-site server. Red standby lights had meant active recording, not outage. Pike requested immediate export to Federal Drive. IT complied in silence. Lena sat wrapped in warmed blankets on a gurney just outside the bay, oxygen cannula under her nose, voice rough as torn cloth but steady enough to answer questions. Text came at 23:52, she whispered. Container, 44 staging. I screenshotted it? Where's that screenshot? Pike asked. Encrypted account, same folder as freight anomalies. Pike nodded once. We'll pull it with consent. Drew stood near the wall with Atlas at heel, watching every movement the way he watched exfil zones. Pike approached him after conferring with Marcy. You're Drew Thompson, she said. He nodded. Your statement matches 3 independent videos so far. I need one more thing. She held up a gloved evidence bag containing Grant's phone. The screen was cracked but still lit. recording app frozen on Lena's face against steel. He filmed the assault himself. Drew looked at the phone, then at Grant in cuffs, then back to Pike. He always thought record meant control. By sunrise, they used Lena's written consent and 2 agents to retrieve the physical drive from her duplex. The flour jar was exactly where she said, tape still under the rim, drive wrapped in wax paper. Mateo's wolf drawing stayed on the fridge under the lighthouse magnet, while agents photographed but did not remove it. Chain of custody form logged at 6:43. Cloud Vault contents were downloaded in the hospital legal suite with Lena present and Pike observing 27 core files, 10 cross-reference screenshots, deleted routing code capture, shell vendor invoice trail, and the midnight text directing Lena to 44. Marcy surrendered her scrub pocket audio recordings. 2 dock hands provided original manifest photos and revised versions with mismatched timestamps. The clerk in blue scrubs gave over his tablet video and said, voice breaking, I saw it and looked down. I saw it and looked down. Nobody let him hide behind that sentence. At 9:10 a.m., in the same conference room where counsel had once told Lena to be patient, the board sat rigid while Pike read a preservation order and a federal fraud notice. Charles Hartwell tried to interrupt twice. Each time Pike raised one hand and kept reading. When she reached the line naming Hartwell Logistics Group as a target entity, hospital counsel stopped taking notes and closed his pen. What do you need from us? One board member asked, barely audible. Everything, Pike said. Vendor contracts, donor influence disclosures, procurement approvals, freight override permissions, and resignation letters if you approved what you didn't audit. 3 members resigned before noon. Procurement authority at Hartwell Pavilion was suspended by written vote at 12:27 p.m. in that same room, with Lena's bruising still visible above her blanket collar while she watched by secure video from observation. By the second night after the assault, Grant and Charles appeared in county court for arraignment. The courtroom smelled like old wood and wet coats. Grant wore county khaki and stared at the table. Charles sat beside retained counsel and spoke only once. This is overreach. The prosecutor placed a stack of exhibits on the rail and answered, Exhibits A through Q include your son's video, corridor footage, dispatch audio, and records from your own freight system. Bail was denied for Grant on violence and witness retaliation risk. Asset freeze motions were granted on 3 Hartwell contracting shells before the hearing ended. In the quiet that followed, justice looked less like triumph and more like breathing room. Lena's breathing finally settled in a step-down room that smelled of warmed saline and clean cotton. Mateo sat in a chair too big for him, knees knocking the seat edge, clutching his green backpack and watching every monitor line as if attention could hold them steady. He had arrived with his caregiver and a hospital social worker just after lunch, eyes red, voice small. I brought your wolf dog drawing, he told Lena, and set the paper on her blanket. Atlas waited at the doorway until Drew gave the release tap. Then he crossed the room slowly, right hip hitch, faint but visible, and stopped beside Lena's bed. She lifted her hand an inch. Atlas lowered his muzzle into her palm, warm and solid, and she closed her fingers in his fur. Thank you, she whispered. I needed one more minute. Atlas lifted his head toward her voice, then turned and pressed it into Drew's chest, hard enough to shift the fabric of his uniform. Drew rested his scarred hand between Atlas's ears and stayed there, eyes closed for 2 breaths, the first unguarded breaths anyone had seen from him all night. 4 days later, Pike asked Lena and Drew to come to a federal interview room for affidavit review before grand jury filing. The room was plain, coffee burnt, recorder red light steady. Pike slid one final document across the table. "We traced the counterfeit oxygen subcontract chain," she said. "Your procurement trail linked it to 3 hospitals, and 1 military transport supplier retired after incident review. Same component line?" Drew read the manufacturer code once, then again. The letters and numbers were the same sequence he had memorized from Nolan Reed's casualty packet, and never spoken out loud, because speaking would make it fixed forever. "This is the manifold line from Yemen," he said. Pike nodded. "Evidence supports that conclusion." Silence held the room for a long moment. Lena reached across the table and set 2 fingers on the edge of the affidavit, not touching Drew, just anchoring the page in place while he read. Atlas, lying at Drew's boots, raised his head and watched both of them, ears forward, then settled when Drew exhaled. For 4 years, Drew had carried a question, like shrapnel no surgeon could remove. In that room, under fluorescent light and federal letterhead, the question finally had a name, a chain, and signatures that would answer to a court. He signed his statement. Lena signed hers. Pike signed chain of custody on the last evidence drive and closed the file. Outside, evening light turned Atlas's tan and black coat briefly gold across the parking lot before a shadow took it back to iron. And this time, when Drew walked toward the exit, he did not look over his shoulder.